aggregate demand. So AD, aggregate demand. Now, with the aggregate demand curve, we want to be thinking about all the people who potentially are buying crap down here. Who does that include? Who's buying all this stuff, the demand curve, so to speak? Who's buying the stuff? Consumers, yes. Businesses, and government. All of them are buyers, right? We go back to cigarettes, C plus I plus G plus X. All of them compose real gross domestic product. And we could throw foreigners in there for that matter too. So with aggregate demand, our players, so to speak, our players in the market is everybody we've come to know and love here. We've got consumers or households more generally, if we think back to our circular flow diagram. We got households, businesses, governments, and row, the rest of the world. In fact, it's kind of helpful to think back to our expenditure approach to measuring real GDP. Real GDP can be broken down into those players' parts, their fraction of GDP that they make up. C plus I plus G plus X. Where we've got primarily consumers, primarily businesses buying machines and equipment, government buying weapons of mass destruction, and the rest of the world, imports and exports. Us buying from other places around the world, them buying from us. So all the players in the market kind of boil down to that. And so now here what we're going to do is kind of make a little bit of a switch, kind of a little sleight of hand by the economists maybe. And we're simply going to say, well, we can imagine then the demand by each one of those people, which is then going to be basically the same thing. The aggregate demand for the economy comes about from these four agents. That demand curve looks very similar to the demand curve we would see in microeconomics. Holding all other things constant, as prices tend to fall, people are willing and able to buy more stuff. There's a wealth effect that the purchasing power of their wealth goes up. They can afford to buy more things if prices are cheaper on average. So that's on the consumption side. We've got government kind of behaving potentially a similar way, although they can be on a different objective. And the rest of the world, when our prices are cheap relative to the rest of the world, they'll tend to buy more stuff from us. So that's where we'll pick up next time, building on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Left off last time introducing the aggregate demand curve, but we just kind of started into it. The aggregate demand curve. And it kind of makes sense intuitively from what we saw in micro class, where we had maybe a downward sloping demand curve for cotton or a downward sloping demand curve for beer or pizza. As the price falls, people buy more. And so that intuition is pretty solid. However, the timing, there's a few other issues since we're dealing with the aggregate demand. So I don't think we defined this last time, did we? Or did I give you a... Did I give you a full definition? Did I write it all out? I just put players, yeah. So today I'm going to define this a little more fully. The aggregate demand. So this function shows the amount of final goods and services demanded by society at various price levels. At various price levels. It is downward sloping by virtue of two effects. By virtue of, one, a wealth effect. And I think I maybe mentioned these, but I didn't write it down. A wealth effect is one reason it's downward sloping. And all I'm trying to explain, for the most part, is a movement from strategically put this a little bit differently, a little more in the center. A movement from, let's say, A to B. If the price level falls from 120 to 110, that is going to increase our wealth, our real wealth. So a decrease in the price level leads to an increase in our real wealth. And by real wealth, we always kind of think back to purchasing power. So real wealth is the purchasing power of your wealth. I think the easiest thing from a micro concept to think about with wealth is your house. We talked about that before during the financial crisis. That had an impact on normal mom and pops around the United States. They were getting wealthier because real estate prices were going up. So the amount of wealth that you have from your house is the house value. So if you have a $150,000 house and you only have a $100,000 debt with the bank, you've got $50,000 worth of equity in your home. And equity is a contributor then to your overall wealth. Now, you can't run to Walmart with equity and buy stuff off the shelves, right? So you'd have to ultimately sell it and then you'd be able to do it. Well, that's kind of the whole concept here, is that if the price level's going down, the purchasing power of that savings, of that equity, goes up. You can buy more things as prices tend to fall over time. Sometimes it might be easier to just flip the arrows the other way, and that's always true unless otherwise noted in this class. If I have an up arrow and it leads to a down arrow, then a down arrow leads to an up arrow, right? So we're always talking about whether variables such as wealth and real wealth and price level are positively related or negatively related. Positive relationship, one goes up, the other goes up. One goes down, the other goes down. That's a positive relationship. Negative, one goes up, the other goes down, or one goes down, the other goes up. Negative and positive relationships. So if we flip the arrows here, an increase in the price level is inflation, leads to a decrease in real wealth. And maybe that one's a little bit easier to think about, but it works in both directions. Okay, so all of that leads us to having greater purchases going on with this wealth effect. B would be a couple substitution effects. So we've got substitution effects. And there's kind of two cases. One type of substitution effect that I think we mentioned before was an intertemporal substitution. Intertemporal. What did that mean? I think we tried to squeeze this out of you before. Anybody want to venture guess? Temporal time, right? Over time. Future versus today. So households can substitute possibly future consumption and current consumption. You guys are doing that. Those of you who are going into debt, you know that you are obligated to pay back that debt. Some people kind of forget that part, right? So you can substitute consumption today by borrowing from tomorrow, right? So you borrow, you can increase your consumption today by taking away consumption from the future, because you'll have to pay back that debt in the next time period, which allows you to consume less that time frame because you're paying back your creditor. So that is a temporal substitution of consumption. Okay, so back to linking it back to the price level then. If there's inflation and prices are going up, we learned that there's a connection there with interest rates. So nominal interest rates are going to go up. We learned from previous chapters in the financing. We saw that with the Fisher formula, the relationship between the real rate and inflation rate and the nominal rates. So an increase in the price level leads to an increase in the interest rates, leading to an increase in saving. But an increase in savings today means that consumption is falling. So an increase in savings, which is, I want to put in parentheses, a decrease in consumption.
Also borrowing, right?
What's that?
As interest rates go up, borrowing goes down.
Right, but here we're looking at their behavior over time. So that's pushing up time, increasing savings. So if we were looking at the savings supply curve, it'd be moving up along the savings supply curve. So increase in savings, decrease in consumption, C plus I plus G plus X equals GDP. I'm ultimately getting back to our variable here, or a decrease in real GDP. All I'm kind of working through is the chain of events that would allow us to make this argument that if there was an increase in the price level, we would have less being consumed and therefore less real GDP. Substituting over time. Foreigners are going to have effect too. So if we look at the rest of the world, we have an international substitution going on with international prices. A decrease in the price level makes American goods look more attractive relative to Chinese goods, assuming they're being held constant. So a decrease in the price level makes U.S. goods more attractive than row goods, the rest of the world's goods. Does that lead to an increase in U.S. exports or a decrease? An increase. So that leads to an increase in exports, which is an increase in net exports. This is our X from cigarettes, again, which leads to an increase in real GDP, or Y. Been kind of writing these back and forth just to get you comfortable with swapping cap Y and real GDP. Okay, so those are just some reasons why we'd see this relationship. I think our gut feeling overall, prices fall, we want to buy more, but there's other things going on, and that's why it's a little more complicated looking at the wealth effect and the rest of the world. Before I forget, Kyle, after class, don't forget to post hours. Okay? And then we'll talk about it after class. But all right, shifters. Things get a little more interesting when we bring in shifters. In fact, this is where really most of the story comes to us for the chapter.